Good evening. Welcome everybody. Nice to see you all practice together. It's a beautiful thing. And happy Earth Day. Today's Earth Day. And it's like so beautiful outside. Have you guys noticed, I had noticed, oh, there's flowers growing. And last week I went to Arizona to teach a retreat, and then afterwards I went to some national parks. Of course I did. And while I was in the neighborhood, and it was just so great, just to see these national parks. So I'm kind of filled up with the beauty of nature and these things. So kind of on that theme, I wanted to talk about maybe nature a little bit, but I'll start with this poem. And this poem is by Galway Kinnell, who is an American poet. He was the Nobel Laureate of Literature in 1983. And this is just a short poem that it's pointing to some of the same things I'd like to point to in this talk. The poem is called Daybreak, and it's by Galway Kinnell. Maybe I should say that I listened to a recording of Galway Kinnell speaking this poem. It was really great. He did a great job. I really loved how he read it. But he mentioned that he wrote this poem after spending some time on the Barrier Reef, the Great Barrier Reef, outside of Australia. And then I guess he would go for walks on the shore. So just to give a little bit of context. So, Daybreak by Galway Kinnell. On the tidal mud, just before sunset, dozens of starfishes were creeping. It was as though the mud were a sky, and enormous, imperfect stars moved across it slowly, as the actual stars cross heaven. All at once they stopped, and as if they had simply increased their receptivity to gravity, they sank down into the mud. They faded down into it and lay still. And by the time pink of sunset broke across them, they were as invisible as the true stars at daybreak. So he's just very simply describing, he saw a bunch of starfish that were moving across the mud, and he's a poet, so he kind of felt like starfish, stars in the sky. But there's a few things that he's pointing to in this poem, and one is a real change in perspective. Usually when we think of stars, we think of stars up in the sky, but he's talking about how they're crawling up on the mud and the sky. So there's this value in seeing things from a different perspective. And there can be great value, right? We see things differently when we look at them from a different perspective. And he's also kind of linking these starfish with stars in the sky. Not only do they have the same name, but they're doing some of the same thing. There's this movement across the heaven, or this movement across the mud. And maybe in the same way as the starfish are sinking into the mud, maybe there's a way that the stars kind of sink into the sky as daybreak arises. So some of this commonality of these really disparate things, usually we don't link aquatic creatures with what's in the heavens. But here he does, he makes this connection. And in the Buddhist teachings, there's also these types of connections. First, this value in really looking at things from a different perspective. And not only that, to see some of the commonalities, some of the things that are shared with just about everything. And this can be a certain particular practice. And this shift of perspective and seeing things in a similar way, seeing what's common about them, what's similar about them, turns out can be really powerful. Can be really powerful. And so part of the way that we can see this is in the Buddha's teachings on the four elements. So there's going to be different ways in which we can describe the human experience. There's so many different ways, so many different perspectives, so many different lenses we might use. In the same way that we could describe the weather today outside in Redwood City, we could say it was pleasant. That's one way we could say. We could say it was 73 degrees Fahrenheit or 23 degrees Celsius, or these are all different ways to express or maybe to look at things, but it's all pointing to the same thing, like how the temperature was, the feeling, the experience of the temperature today. And we can use different ways to talk about it. And different people in different parts of the world use Fahrenheit or use Celsius or use different language. It's all okay, right? It's all describing the same thing. It's not like one is the truth and the other aren't the truth. They're all the truth. They're just different ways. And in the same way with our minds, with our psychology, with our inner lives, what is happening? There's these different perspectives of modern psychology. We can think about the mind differently. There's this psychodynamic perspective that Freud brought, the id and the ego and the superego. Or there's this like behavioral perspective that probably I think it's B.F. Skinner, maybe like this idea of the dogs, Pavlov, I guess, is how the dogs salivate when they hear the bell. Just this idea of, these patterns, these habits that we get into. Or maybe there's a way we could look at the inner life with cognitive processing, this how we think about things, and we could train ourselves to think about them differently, to have different thoughts. Or maybe there's also like a biological perspective. What are the neurotransmitters and what is the whole nervous system doing? So those are all like different lenses of looking at the inner life. And in the same way, we have different lenses that we can look at this bodily experience. What it's like to be a human in a body. What it's like to have a body. And so in the Buddhist tradition, there's these 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Earth, water, air, and fire. And in modern times, we might kind of scoff at that, like, oh, isn't that cute? How the Buddhists, thousands of years ago, they thought about these 4 elements. Whereas, in modern day, right, we think about elements, or those of us who are trained as chemists, we think often like, there's the periodic table, there's the number of protons in the atom, right? Those types of things, right? But the Buddhists, the Buddha, I should say, they were thinking more about like the Buddhist philosophy, maybe we would say, is how could they use this idea of elements as a support for greater freedom, greater ease, greater peace, awakening, liberation? How can they use this idea of elements, which they had at that time, as a support for practice? And so one way that they did this is to, of course, they recognized earth, water, fire, and air, but more specifically, they kind of like expanded the definition of these elements to talk about particular principles or qualities that is in everything, all things, and that can be expressed by the earth element, water, air, and fire, and air. For example, the stiffness, the solidity, the softness or hardness of something can be expressed by the earth element, like how solid something feels. And then there's this sense of fluidity or cohesion, both of those, with the water element, fluidity, I think we're accustomed to that, what that mean, water and fluidity makes sense. But cohesion, if we think about, for example, flour, you just put some flour in a bowl, you have flour in a bowl. But you add water, and then all of a sudden it sticks together, and you can get a dough ball, and you can make dough and make bread from it. Or in the same way, I have this little suction cup thing on my kitchen sink, and it doesn't stick unless I put water between that and the side of the sink, right? Suction cups, they kind of like need water to help with this cohesion. Or there's a way that water, when it's not wet, just these sheets of paper can slide against one another, but when there's water there, they glomp together. So water is a part of this sense of cohesion, that things holding together. And then fire element is this idea of temperature, like the degree of heat, whether it's hot or cold. This can be described by the fire element. And then this idea of motion, or movement, or vibration, or oscillation, or something like that, can be described by the air element. And so, of course, if we think about this, it's not possible for these qualities to exist in an object singularly. Like all objects, all things, have a little bit of all four of these. But one of them may be predominant. For example, if we think of a tree, I think, well, that's pretty solid. But of course, there's also sap in the tree, some cohesion, or some liquidity, and the cohesion as, zoem, xylem, and phloem. Those people who know about botany, right? That the water has to move up from the roots right up to these really, really tall trees, some of them. So of course there's this movement. And there's a degree of warmth or coolness in the tree. Probably it's not too different than what the external temperature is. But so all things have all of these elements to them. It's just a different way of looking at them or considering them. Well, what is the degree of movement in something like this? Or what is the degree of temperature? Is it warm or cool, or is it in between? So the early Buddhist analysis of this matter into elements was more concerned about qualities than actual, like this is the truth of the universe, or this is early physics. That's not what's being pointed to here. Instead, it's this recognition that, if we think about, for example, earth element, we can think about, well, almost all things have a sense of like resistance or a sense of solidness or something that can be pushed against. And there's a way in which this kind of like unites things. Oh, this is something that things exist. That they share. In modern times, we would say, yeah, they probably, have some carbon and hydrogen and some oxygens or something like this. But instead, this is pointing to the qualities. And there's something that happens when the mind starts to pay attention to qualities of things rather than just the label for things. Rather than just like chair. Of course, chair has a lot of solidness to it. And maybe the movement isn't obvious, at this level, but if we were to zoom way in, I'm reaching here a little bit, but right, we do know that there's a lot of space and there's a movement, right, when we get down to the atoms. And it has a certain amount of temperature, and it has a cohesion, right? It's not flying apart into different pieces. So maybe that's a silly example, but there's a way in which we can do this with everything. And then when we start to consider things by the qualities that they have, then our relationship to them shifts. Instead of seeing the chair as something that I sit in, something that Jim very nicely moves around on the Monday evenings. And these particular chairs, the seat's a little bit tall for me, so I have to put something. So I have a story with these chairs. So all of a sudden I have a relationship that has to do with me and what it's like to sit in them. And I'm not the person that put them there, somebody else put them there. It's so all these stories kind of get tied up with it. But it's different if I'm thinking about the qualities, the hardness of the rims versus the softness of the cushion. There's a different earth element. So these elements are elements, right? It doesn't matter whether it's in a chair, it's in this bell, it's in me, it's in you, in the wall behind me, in this microphone that I'm speaking into. Elements are elements. Qualities are qualities. And so there's something that happens when we start to consider the body, our own body. Because there's this difference, there's these advantages of when we consider our own bodies in terms of the elements. And there's practice discussions directing this. Some of you may know this in the Satipatthana Sutta. One of the primary discourses of the Buddha that mindfulness instructions come from. And the instructions are, a person reviews their body, however it is placed, however disposed, by way of the elements thus. In this body there is the earth element. In this body there is the water element. In this body there is the fire element. And in this body is the air element. And then a little bit later it says, in this way they abide contemplating the body internally, externally, and both internally and externally. So not only considering how this body has these properties of solidity, cohesion, temperature, and movement, but how things out there also have solidity, fluidity or cohesion, and movement, and temperature. So then we can ask ourselves, this division we tend to create between these elements in this body as something that I am, and manifestations, things that are out there, as something different than I am. Of course they are on some level, but also, of course, there's some way in which, we share these qualities, just like the starfish on the beach, kind of like the stars in the sky. They shared movement. I don't know if the stars move, maybe it was more the earth moves, but poetic license here. And sinking into the mud or disappearing into the sky. So we might ask ourselves, literally, at what point does the food we eat, which of course is coming from, literally the earth, and literally water, and literally air, and literally it has to be the right temperature, but we can also think of it just as, these qualities of solidity and cohesion and temperature and movement. At what point do we consider that the vegetables, at one point there are carrots there in the ground, we eat the carrot, and then it becomes a part of this body. That's why we eat. So where is the distinction precisely between what's external, what's internal, between what's not me and what is me? The carrot we often think is like, okay, it's not me, but is it when we start to chew it and swallow it, does it just all of a sudden get transformed as me? Something that's part of me? And if we really start to think about this, that we've discovered that we can't really find a clear distinction that everybody can agree on, like, oh, okay, it's something else, and then precisely at this moment it transforms into this body. And the same could be said with the opposite process. When is it no longer the body? It's like when it's gone into the intestines, or when it's gone into the toilet, or like this process of elimination. When is it no longer the body? It was part of the body before, and now it no longer is. So there's this way in which this division that we tend to create between what's external and what's internal maybe kind of puts into question and isn't so clear or isn't so obvious. Because the elements are the elements are the elements. And then you might ask, well, why does this matter, Diana? Well, one way, this helps us to feel connected with nature. Helps us to see how, of course, we're part of nature. We are nature. We are not different. And there's something about that kind of helps soften the sense of like me, and me being so important, and it's all about me. It's kind of like self-centeredness that humans often have. We could start to see, oh no, I'm just part of nature, just like the carrots and the trees and the ocean and everything else that's out there, everything that's been manufactured by humans, as well as everything that hasn't been manufactured by humans. So it helps us to feel connected to our environment, not so distinct, as well as diminishing this strong sense of I and me. And this strong sense of I and me is the source of a lot of our attachment, of our clinging. We're trying to promote this sense of I, or defend this sense of I, make it look good, or make sure that people see it the way we want them to see it. So we're having to say things or do things, or trying to make sure they don't see these certain aspects of ourselves. All these ways, and these ways we kind of pretzel ourselves into kind of protecting this sense of I, making sure it looks good and that it's consistent with the way that we want to see it or feel it. But when we start to see, oh no, we're just part of nature too, then that can soften. And then there's this way in which when we start to consider the qualities of the body, these elements. How many times have I said this? Solidity, fluidity, temperature, and movement. When we start to consider them in the body, when we start to do the practices that the Buddha recommend, and that is to do a body scan, which is considering the earth element. Often that can be like with clenching one's teeth, kind of like this. Like that's very strong. And then the liquid, we can, like the saliva in the mouth. The temperature, we can just consider the temperature of how our hands are when they touch one another. And the air is like the movement, we can consider how the body moves as it breathes. So you can do a body scan, just kind of like tuning into these different elements. And as we do that, as we start to tune into like the experiences, the movement, the temperature, the fluidity or cohesion, then that's a shift in perspective about our bodies. And that shift in perspective also tends to minimize this sense of thinking that the body is this stable, constant, separate thing that somehow we can control or somehow is beautiful or not beautiful, as the case may be, whatever we might think. Instead of those types of ideas, which are only ideas. They're only ideas. It's all in the mind. Actually, what the body is, right, is this collection of experiences. That's all it is. The mind is saying, oh, this is separate from everything else, or it's special, or it's stable and doesn't change, or something like this. But if we move away from the ideas, the notions, the beliefs, the views that we have about our body and other people's bodies and bodies in general, move away from that to the actual experience, the tingling in the hand, the pressure of the cushion or the chair against the body, the feeling of the coolness against the skin. Then there's this way of which we can really tune into our experience, and we notice that it's changing. Of course it is. It's always changing. And there's this, when we deeply recognize the changing nature of the experience, all of our experiences, and we see this repeatedly and we experience this repeatedly, then there's this way in which the mind kind of like does this letting go. It no longer wants to hold on to this body because it sees that, oh no, it's just a collection of changing experiences. This idea of a stable, constant body is just an idea. It's a useful idea and we need to use it in our daily life, but it's not the only perspective. There's this other perspective that leads to greater freedom. There's this other perspective that leads to greater peace and well-being. Because often what happens when we have this concept of body, in particular my body, what happens, this goes like almost simultaneously or goes together. My body gets compared to others' bodies. Or maybe it starts the other way. Seeing others' bodies gets compared to my body. This is what humans do. They compare. And this comparing is part of this, like this deep pattern that humans have. The Buddha had a word for it called mana. And it's this way of which there's this deeply rooted sense of I am, or I was, or I will be. This sense of I gets solidified when bodies are compared to other bodies. This sense of I am is one of the last defilements to go away before awakening. So it's something that until you're completely awakened is one that you have. But when we are comparing our bodies, notice how often there's these thoughts that arise. They can be this myriad of thoughts. Or there can be emotions that get triggered when we are comparing. Like, oh, I should go to the gym more. Oh, I should eat less cookies. Or, oh, I should go to the gym less. Or, I should walk more. Whatever it is, these ideas that we have about our bodies when they're compared to others. But if we just see the body as this interplay of the elements, then this conceit, this mana of I am, gets softened, and all of these thought patterns and emotions that are related to comparing ourselves to others can fall away. There can be so much less dukkha in our lives. So again, I'm not saying this is the only way to consider the body, right? There are useful times to consider, okay, this is my body, and it's distinct and separate from everything else there. I'm talking about a shift in perspective and looking at things differently. This can be a practice that we do and can be enormously helpful. Helpful to let us let go of some of the attachments that we have. Help us let go of some of the ideas we have about how we should be or how others should be or should not be or something like this. There's so much dukkha, so much suffering associated with this. So maybe I'll just say that one way that the Buddha talked about this is, well, maybe I'll start with one way that Analayo talked about this. And some of you may know he's a scholar, monk. He's an amazingly productive scholar, and he's like a lot of really delving into the Pali Canon as well as the parallels that are preserved in other languages, and kind of like teasing apart, well, what are the meanings here? And I really appreciate the way that he talks about practicing, just what it's like to practice with the elements, looking at the elements, whether it's solidity, fluidity, temperature, or movement. He says that it's like receiving a parcel that is meant for someone else. So you get this box, you look at it and like, oh, it doesn't have my name on it. So there's no need to open the box and look at it and have an emotional response or thoughts about it and all this kind of stuff. Instead, you just look at the address label, realize, oh, it's not mine, and then return it to the mail person. So it's kind of like what we can do, kind of like with the experience of the body. Instead of having said like, oh, this is mine, and I'm going to compare it to everybody else's, like, oh, no, it's not mine, and give it back. I kind of like this idea of this way of working with how the elements can help us, what we might say, like disidentify with the body. And again, I don't want to say like there is no such thing as distinct bodies or anything like this. I'm talking about a very helpful perspective to use that can lead to greater and greater freedom. And in the same way, the Buddha, he used a simile that's sprinkled throughout the Pali Canon, so maybe pointing to the same idea but using something different, which actually in modern times I kind of find to be a little gruesome and very un-Buddhist, we might say. And so the Buddha, he gives this simile of a butcher who slaughters a cow and butchers it and sells it. So this is a little bit offensive, but he was just using the ordinary experience of probably what was there in society at that time. That there'd be vendors that would be doing this. But he's pointing to, while the cow is still whole, we consider it a cow, whether the cow's alive or dead. If it's long, it's a cow. But as soon as the butcher, this is gruesome, starts to butcher it into little pieces, all of a sudden it's flank steak and T-bone, I don't know what these are, these different things that are, right there, it's no longer cow. So in the same way in which kind of like using this perspective of looking at the elements is a way to help us kind of loosen our identity with our body, which is a way that can help support more and more freedom, to soften this sense of self, so that we don't always having to be protecting it or defending it or hiding behind it or something like this. So maybe in the same way as Galway Kinnell was talking about these starfish that are moving across the mud, like the stars that are moving across the heaven, like this really different perspective, and yet they're both kind of like, stars in some kind of way, and they share, right? They're both moving, they have this certain amount of solidity. Stars much less solidity than starfish. Some cohesion, maybe stars again, right? They're kind of like moving out, I guess. I'm not an astrophysicist, but starfish have cohesion as well, and temperature. They of course have temperature. So they have these things the same. So maybe in the same way, here's a poet, and I don't know exactly when he wrote this poem. I think it got published in the 1980s, so he wrote it sometime before then. He's pointing to something similar to what the Buddha is pointing to, and kind like maybe where we can have this shift in perspective that can help bring some more freedom and ease to our lives. So I'll end there and open it up for some questions or comments. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. So when I first came here today, I kind of like struggled to kind of like, sit and like meditate. And one of the talks that we had a few weeks back was like trying to like turn the mundane and like see it in a different perspective, right? And I remember I heard like someone sneeze. And it made me kind of just like be conscious of the fact that we're all like sharing the same air, which is kind of funny that the talk today is about like the four elements, because like that concept of like sharing the air, like coupled with like shifting perspectives, helped me really kind of like remember that like I'm not alone, and like we're all here to practice together, and even if like we're all coming from different like circumstances or contexts, and after this we go our separate ways, like as we're all here like at this very hour, it's kind of cool to like like be in that sense of like cohesion and sharing in the same movement of the breath, and it helped me like really feel not alone, and also like helped me like settle into my practice, because like I know everyone else is like settling into theirs, so I just found that to be very timely, so thanks for that.
Nice. Thank you. I actually had in my notes to talk about this, how it kind of helps us feel connected to others, right? Because of course all humans have these same elements that we do. So thank you for saying that. Anybody else have a comment or a question or something they'd like to say? Maybe I'll just read this poem then as a closing. It's kind of nice to hear poems again after you've heard more about them. So this is called Daybreak by Galway Kinnell. On the tidal mud, just before sunset, dozens of starfishes were creeping. It was as though the mud were a sky and enormous, imperfect stars moved across it slowly, as the actual stars cross heaven. All at once they stopped, and as if they had simply increased their receptivity to gravity, they sank down into the mud. They faded down into it and lay still, and by the time pink of sunset broke across them, they were as invisible as the true stars at daybreak. Oh, I love this poem. Kind of, it's just there's some tenderness or sweetness about it I kind of like. So maybe I'll end with that. Thank you. And wishing you all a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.